In the sleeve notes of In Time, the best of REM 1988-2003, Peter Buck recalls the band's 1991 single Losing My Religion, practically writing itself. Losing My Religion feels like some kind of archetype that was floating around in space that we managed to lasso, he wrote. If only all songwriting was this easy. David Byrd's painting is a lot like this. A kind of archetypal, expressive figure painting that was floating in the ether, waiting for someone to set it down in pictures. Inevitable, but only after the fact. Arriving apparently fully formed and in electric harmony with his subject matter, most notably his experiences as a ward attendant at a mental hospital. Byrd's painting went through little obvious development over time, yet remains compelling and strangely contemporary from beginning to end. Documentary, but too dreamy, too painterly for conceptual practices of the 1970s. Impossibly expressive, but not obviously neo-expressionist enough for the 1980s. Temporally indeterminate in its skewed Americana, and milky and muted in colour, but not ironic enough for the postmodern 1990s. All the things that might have kept Byrd's painting critically neglected in the past are now major things in its favour. As if the work waited it out before arriving perfectly on time. Overt expressionism can often come across as forced, but Byrd achieves maximum expression almost by avoiding it. Contrary to the difficult experiences of the figures portrayed, there is a quietness and an ease to the paintings, as if he simply set down what he saw, thought, and felt. But of course, there's much more going on than simple documentary work, exceptional as they are in that regard as well. Often neither straightforwardly pitiable or even necessarily sympathetic, the anguished figures can equally look like gymnasts, dancers, performers. They can be both frightened and frightening, reflecting an understated, sometimes ambivalent attitude to the patients and their suffering, an attitude which carries over to the outside world and society at large. Determining the exact nature of the work asks us to consider larger questions about the relationship of painted images to lived experience, the relationship of painted images to what we might call truth. We might think of Byrd, for example, as a uniquely expressive documentarian, or equally a singularly restrained documentary expressionist. Either positioning of the work is equally valid, even as it makes us question what we might mean by words like documentary or expression, exposing the thin, shivery line between them. Born in Springfield, Illinois in 1926, Byrd would briefly study art at a GI-sponsored program in Philadelphia, followed by 2 years at the Ozenfant School of Fine Arts in New York City. Drifting through several low-skilled jobs, he would eventually settle as an orderly at the Montrose Veterans Administration Hospital in 1958. He would remain there for 30 years. Retiring in 1988, he purchased a plot of land in Sydney Centre, a small hamlet in the Catskills, where he would spend the next 6 years beavering away on building his own home and studio from mostly salvaged materials. Devoting himself to painting and eventually taking up sculpture, he all but withdrew from the world. A chance meeting with neighbour and artist Jody Isaacson would lead to his first public exhibitions, and a growing acclaim he wouldn't live to see. The paintings based on his time working in the psychiatric ward have come to dominate commentary on Byrd's work. And it makes sense. There's very little precedent for such a project in painting. We might think of Géricault's so-called portraits of the insane, or perhaps even Soutine's engagement with the world of work, his non-patronising portraits of working-class people in the service industry, recalling Byrd's statement that bad jobs can produce good pictures. But of course, neither of these semi-documentary series are anything as sustained or as intimate as Byrd's. The paintings perhaps unavoidably bring to mind Ken Kesey's classic 1962 novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Like Byrd, Kesey worked as a porter at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital in California in the 1960s. And the novel draws on pretty much the exact same world of experience. A world of day rooms and nurses' stations, doors and windows, listlessness and quiet despair. What's perhaps most striking is the more metaphorical imagery which Kesey's novel and Byrd's paintings share. Imagery Milos Forman's well-known film adaptation can't really engage with. Throughout the book, which is told from the alternatingly lucid and hallucinatory perspective of a patient, there's a constant stream of automaton and puppet imagery. Staff run along the floor on magnets. Heads are pulled up by strings. Eyes are blown fuses. In a passage that eerily conjures up an image of Byrd's painting, the narrator describes the ward as being like a cartoon world where the figures are flat and outlined in black, jerking through some goofy story that might be real funny if it weren't for the cartoon figures being real guys. The parallels run even further as the imagery develops into an ever more absurd territory of amusement arcades and carnival barkers. Imagery that also occurs either explicitly or implicitly in Byrd's painting, relating to his time working as a bartender on Coney Island. Or further back, to a time when his mother worked the ticket booth at a movie theatre. All these image worlds spill into one another from time to time, setting to setting, in a dizzyingly circular visual imagination that recalls one patient's description of electroshock therapy. It's as if the jolt sets off a wild carnival wheel of images, emotions, memories. The barker takes your bet and pushes a button, chang, with light and sound and numbers, round and round, in a whirlwind. Whenever Byrd paints the outside world, we get the slightly unnerving sense that it might not be all that different from the more regulated one within the hospital grounds. It appears either as a memory or as something glimpsed in a series of intense fragments while running errands, attending country auctions or picking up supplies and coming back with pictures. Only the thinnest of lines separates the nurse arranging the patient's dietary cards and the cashiers at Walmart. The Lowry-esque characters we encounter there are as strange to us as the patients at Montrose, if not stranger. In fact, it's the people on the outside who seem way more threatening. We get the feeling that the mall or the auction house could erupt into a frenzy at any moment, the images increasingly disturbing the longer that we stare at them. An auctioneer holds up the next lot like a zombie might hold a brain, while sweet old ladies look on. A man holds up a doll like a fast food order to go. Everything appears like some kind of absurdist play at the end of days. It's pretty much 100% guaranteed that Samuel Beckett never saw a single painting by David Byrd, but he surely would have appreciated them. This is his 1977 television play, Ghost Trio. The figure is slumped like a puppet, and the play itself was perhaps partially inspired by Heinrich von Kleist's Über das Marionettentheater, or On the Marionette Theatre, an 1810 essay in which he suggests that it's mankind's crushing self-consciousness which prevents it from attaining the inherent grace and balance of a god, or a puppet. Told through a series of anecdotes and conversations, the essay uses the shift from adolescence to adulthood as a metaphor for the biblical fall, reasoning that the self-consciousness which comes with a loss of innocence is what renders adult human behaviour awkward, ill-set, off-kilter, out of whack, resulting in the need for masking, social camouflaging, jobs, roles, performance. What passes for sanity? The irony of Byrd's figures is that for all they resemble puppets in their strange, awkward grace, they've been judged as aberrations by society. Having cut their social strings, they've been put away. Out of sight, out of mind. Just as important as the figures are the backdrops they play against. The hospital patients in particular occupy impossibly bare spaces, which often recall Beckett's stripped-down sets. But they equally bring to mind the alcoves and sightless windows in Henry Moore's celebrated drawings of the 1940s. Pictures with an interminable, purgatorial sense of waiting, which call back to his experiences of wartime. His drawing of crowds taking refuge from the Blitz in the tunnels of the London Underground, the figures sheltering from bombs, something like Byrd's hospital patients huddled together in the day room, or struggling with their blankets and clothes. Unusually for the time, Moore's drawings were published in a facsimile edition, a lot like Byrd's Montrose sketchbook, adding to their sense of journalistic significance, and bringing us back once again to the collision of documentary and expressive form, the series of negotiations from one to the other, which the artist has to either navigate or ignore. Moore's rounded, contoured figures perhaps owe something in turn to those of Daumier, an artist similarly operating from an area somewhere between reportage and expression, exploring social conditions and their effects on the body, and on how bodies relate to one another within those social conditions. Jammed together on the omnibus, for example, peering out the small windows, which we also find in both Moore and in Byrd. Metaphors for constricted prospects and constricted souls. From the Enlightenment onward, we find images of strangers crammed together in a shared space, with little or no glimpse of an outside world. From omnibus to bomb shelter to mental ward, it connotes a modern form of listlessness, indignity, and imprisonment, whether literally, mentally, or socially. All this to say, Byrd operates in a well-defined area of expression. Yet the specific expressiveness of the work is all his own. Byrd became a near-total recluse in the years after his retirement, scavenging materials for the house, collecting bottles, at some point taking up sculpture and assemblage on the side. Working in complete isolation from the art world, he tried to get his Montrose book published, with no success. One of his most poignant images of social withdrawal is man and institution. As with the walker in Van Gogh's garden of St. Paul's Hospital, the blue figure hovers like a paper cutout tacked to the scenery. We assume it's a patient, but it could equally be some kind of mental apparition, or even an exercise set by a psychologist the patient asked to visualize his own re-entry into society in scissors and glue, paper and paint. And perhaps there's even the subliminal suggestion of a child's figure drawing behind him, speaking of memory and regression. Though they can equally register as a bride and groom on a wedding cake, the institution in this case being marriage. The main path splits up into a series of implied triangles, none of which reach completion in themselves or lead in a coherent direction. They suggest the predetermined movements of a mechanical figure in a clock, the man cuckooing out from the main archway. The colours are drained, numbed. He shares the pale blues and pinks of the institution behind him, but he also stands apart in a black, perforated outline, like something to cut out and keep. We don't know if he's leaving, waiting for a ride, having been deemed either cured or incurable, or whether he's only temporarily regained a partial sense of self in the fresh air. Then again, the perspective is odd enough that he could be standing in front of a mural, leaning flat against a wall. The space contracts. The institution pulls him back, on the verge of stepping out on a new path, but immobilized. Nothing jumps out. Everything unnerves. It's this sensitivity and originality of form which makes Byrd so uniquely able to express so much without falling into the traps of overcooked expressionism. Puppet, mannequin, and automaton imagery are common enough motifs in 20th century art, a response to what was seen as an increasingly mechanical form of existence. Just as puppet and mime associations are an equally big thing in Austro-German expressionism, the difference with Byrd being that this kind of body language is ultimately grounded in some kind of reality, no matter how exaggerated, never feeling forced or over-aestheticized. On the other hand, his motivations are often as much pictorial or formal as they are documentary or empathetic. In one passage of Montrose VA, he gleefully extols the expressive virtues of soapsuds, calling shower and shaving foam a great unconscious decorator and designer, a device that turns people into primitive sculpture. Then again, most people can probably identify with the transformative mental, physical relief of showering which these pictures evoke, whether or not they began as moments of purely visual intrigue. Byrd's painting also avoids the gargantuan scale, the blaring colours and overwrought brushstrokes which expressionism can often fall into, the forcefulness of the painter short-circuiting an emotive engagement with the subject. Instead, the palette is often soothing, calming. The 1981 painting Autumn, like a classroom map of the world, a succinct, chromatic expression of rustic insularity. Even the most distressing of images and scenarios have a pleasantly faded, fresco-like quality to them. Their summary lightness of tone and touch only making the heaviness of the subject hit that much harder. Nature and landscape also tend to offer some sense of respite across the work, much as they might for anyone momentarily escaping the confines of an institution, whether that be a mental hospital or society in general. In one of Montrose's longer passages, he recalls spending time in the woods around the hospital, the contrast making the geometry of the wards and hallways seem abstract and enjoyable for a time on his return, though nature itself is rarely untouched in the pictures, and the noise of the world is never far away. Except, ironically, in the empty hallways of Montrose, his most truly isolated landscapes. Formally, Byrd's work remains pretty much consistent from the 1950s to the 1990s and into the 2000s, just as it remains broadly consistent between subjects and genres. A consistency we tend to associate more with self-taught or outsider artists, since it's rare to find a trained artist committing so fully and forcefully to a personal vision over such a long time without the quality dipping or the work becoming repetitive or mannered. Brooklyn Park, a picture apparently from as far back as 1950, already acquits itself with the same palette of dry pinks and tans and quail egg greens and blues, which will reappear for the next 60 years. The same hatching strokes, the same sense of both stillness and vibration, the gaunt trees already anticipating the patients he'd be working with by the end of the decade. There's also just an inherently bark-like quality to the way Byrd often paints skin, the flesh weathered and whittled in dry flecks. If anything, his figures have much more in common with Paula Modersohn-Becker's haunting trees than any of his closer neighbours in figure painting. Mostly known for portraits, the birch trees are perhaps, ironically, her most expressive works. Very unusual and distinctive in how they're positioned in the frame. Close to the viewer, more like figures or even characters, in the same way Byrd's figures can equally look like gnarled trunks and branches, reaching out as if they were the damned souls in Dante's Seventh Circle. But the body can just as easily reassert itself in a queasily pervasive anthropomorphism, sometimes in unlikely places. 1985's House in Snow, hiding a face in a mound of earth. Knees under blankets, a grasping arm. As if the hospital's influence has spread through the woods and followed him home. The branch-like entanglements of Byrd's figures are often a byproduct of one of his favourite motifs, the patience of Montrose dressing and undressing, which surprisingly has nothing voyeuristic about it. There's a sense of familiarity, not just with his patients, but with the act itself. A familiarity with the unfamiliarity which our bodies can take on from time to time. The sense of disorientation and confusion when we dress in the dark, say, or when we're drunk, injured, or exhausted. A grounding in reality which prevents their more ecstatic, shamanistic qualities from getting bogged down in pseudo-mythic symbolism. 1994's Man Undressing Shirt, for example, recalls the disrobing figure in Pierrot's baptism, the figure's temporary blindness and public vulnerability, already performing a kind of spiritual rebirthing of sorts, which anticipates the ritual about to take place. Though, of course, Byrd's figures are more obviously struggling, stuck in their polyester cocoons, their contortions miles away from the limpid tranquility of Pierrot's River Jordan, their efforts given no sign of relief, even if they remain on the more relatable side of outright body horror. As always with Byrd, these motifs are explored again and again by stages and increments. 1987's Undressing Pants, for example, shows the patient nearly free, but dancing with his slacks as if they were Peter Pan's shadow. Speaking as it did in Barry's novel of arrested development and dissociative identity. 1989's Man in Doorway focuses our attention on the recurring motif of a patient's feet drowned in oversized pyjamas, a metaphor for his institutionalized existence. They root him to the floor, turning him into a kind of indoor plant man. The almost fetal, egg-like figure of woman stooping, on the other hand, seems both vital and drained, at once athletic and hobbled. Crouched as if starting a race, the clay surface suggestive of a tennis court. We don't know if she's picking something up or tending an injury, if she's healthy or sick. It also falls into the wider subcategory of figures neurotically attending to themselves, ending up in strange positions, burlesquing around the furniture. Their bodies rubbery like Fleischer's Popeye cartoons, alternatively weighty and weightless as required. 1970s Agonized brings all these elements together. The figure clearly suffering, yet straddling the chair like a cabaret performer. The face like one half of a comedy and tragedy mask. The Peter Pan shadow hanging limp, one hand holding it in place, the other pulling it up like a puppeteer, or like Wendy, sewing it back on. Agonized could well be Byrd's most accomplished picture of a mind at the end of its tether. The scarecrow-like figure pinned to the wall in a kind of pseudo-crucifixion, pulling himself apart. The feet rendered useless, twisted out of joint and nailed to the floor. A name, a date. Byrd's unique biography and subject matter can tend to hog the conversation, which is understandable, but his sense of form is just as unique. At the same time, it shouldn't be seen in a complete vacuum. His most significant influence was the French émigré Amédée Ozenfant, a friend and colleague of Le Corbusier, under whom Byrd would study from around 1949 to 1950. Amongst other things, Ozenfant drilled the lessons of Seurat into his students, something we can easily spot in Byrd's fondness for repeating lines and juxtapositions of flat-on faces and profiles, and his almost pointillist technique. Tantalizingly, the well-known and pretty successful Richard Artschwager also studied under Ozenfant in the period between 1949 and 1950. Though, so far as we know, he's never been mentioned in connection with Byrd. A shame, since it's a rare breadcrumb to follow in the life of an artist so cut off from history. Like Byrd, Artschwager would retain a certain geometric rigour from his time at the Ozenfant school. But both of them would quickly go far beyond the hermetic, airless world of their teacher. There's a specificity to their paintings and objects, a haunting domesticity even, compared to Ozenfant's stiffer, purist forms. A sense of character, rather than bland, modernist essentialism. Even if certain resolutely Ozenfantesque shapes seem to have imprinted themselves deep within their formal lexicons, bubbling up to the surface from time to time, like repressed memories. Connecting the three of them in a kind of morphological triangle. Artschwager and Byrd's lives spanned practically the same period, from 1923 and 1926 to 2013 respectively. And though they came from vastly different backgrounds, there are a few telling parallels. Artschwager supported himself for a time as a carpenter, for example, and he shares with Byrd a distinct fondness for furniture as an expressive field of form and psychological association. Though he's also a much slicker and more designy artist, while Byrd takes on much more of the texture and grit of life. At the same time, Byrd's house, allergic to symmetry and mismatched in its many windows, looks equally like someone asked Artschwager to design a bizarre cabin in the woods. A puzzle box of a building, 3 floors tall in reality, but somehow single level in character. Comparing the two only goes to show what a unique artist Byrd really was, even on a purely visual level. Somehow combining poppy, sometimes goofy humour with formal rigour and clear-eyed depictions of humanity in what could easily be the most lurid or overdone of scenarios, without ever sacrificing his own very personal sense of beauty or of life. The rough with the smooth. In fact, Byrd only makes clearer the psychological tensions that underpin Artschwager's apparently insouciant drawings and sculptures. The haunting hallways, the splayed perspectives, the folksy yet off-kilter domestic spaces. His oversized or unusable furniture, a sculptural equivalent to Byrd's explorations of bodily discomfort and dissociation. Aesthetically attractive, but ergonomically misanthropic. It may seem ludicrous to compare Byrd with such an apparently pop-inflected arch-minimalist, but a cold look at his work from a purely formal perspective actually allows us to more fully appreciate the nature of his unique expressiveness. The way in which, for example, his corrugations and zigzagging saw-toothed serrations are part of a lifelong fascination with triangles, and with how triangles alternatively relate to or mess with the human form. The way Byrd uses triangles and implied triangles in figure paintings is quite unlike the way they are used by any other painter. Appearing sometimes like gentle bedsheet landscapes, or conversely, making otherwise gentle landscapes seem alarmingly unstable, crumpling patients into waste paper or letting them become their own trash can. Sometimes they appear abruptly, violently. This shark fin of a blanket bifurcating both the picture and the figure, like the blade of a guillotine. In Undercovers, there's an almost metronome-like quality to the raised arms of the sleeper, suggesting a restless night passing in a relentless monotony that is familiar from the worst nights of anyone's life. At first it looks more like a sheet draped over an improvised drying rack, or something to keep the dust off tools in a garage. Either way, something to be left pretty much unattended, out of sight, out of mind. We remember that Byrd filed several complaints about his colleagues' negligence over the decades, a frustration perhaps baked into the picture, beyond the patient's own personal suffering and the viewer's implied helplessness, underscored perhaps by a mocking, laughing face in the pillow. A less abstracted but more baffling picture. A woken person turns a series of softer triangles into a bagged-up Christmas tree. Or something like the entity in Jonathan Miller's 1968 version of M.R. James' "Oh, whistle, and I'll come to you, my lad." An entity which manifests itself as a literal spectre in a bedsheet. A face, James writes, of crumpled linen. The expressive potential of the triangle, both as a shape and as a compositional device, is often under-evaluated. Barely mentioned by Rudolf Arnhem in his rightly celebrated studies of composition and visual perception, triangles are perhaps the most elastic pictorial form, as they can be stretched or squashed, softened or sharpened as required, while always retaining their divisional relationship to the overall rectangle of the frame. Byrd's triangles capitalise on their own multifunctional ambivalence. They can be simultaneously harmonious and stable, or jagged and discomforting, softly embedded or awkwardly wedged in the composition, striking and architectural, or more subtle and implied. They even appear to have been among the first concerns when planning the house. The lines of the sloping roofs intersecting and multiplying them from every vantage, just as they repeat themselves inside, in objects and shadows, inventoried in drawings, along with his cabinets and bottles and other precious things. For anyone into drawing compositional lines over paintings, Byrd offers a near-endless supply of triangles which propagate within his pictorial systems to almost ASMR levels of satisfaction. The construction of Agonized's left hand pleasing us on an aesthetic level, while acting out the jagged, high-tension drama of the picture in miniature. Triangles, after all, are quite alien to the softened rectangles and cylinders of the human form. Compulsive and recurring, they confirm him, if any confirmation were needed, as a distinctive expressor, as much as a visual documentarian, a thinker and feeler of shape. Whatever the apparent ease with which his experiences made their way into the pictures, we shouldn't mistake them for anything either straightforwardly diaristic or gushingly emotive. To quote Arnhem, it's important to remember that all perceiving is also thinking, all reasoning is also intuition, and all observation is also invention. The presentation of things that happened is a complicated business. Perhaps only slightly more complicated than the presentation of things as they are, perhaps slightly less. David Byrd's self-portrait of 1987 appears here, framed in the doorway of the house, which is in some ways his truest self-portrait. It was hung there, intentionally and on an extremely temporary basis, by those who knew him best in his last years. It greeted us on our arrival, late one night in November. But this shot is the last thing we filmed, the following evening, standing around, waiting for the dark. Trying to recapture the feeling of the night before, which has ultimately been lost to time and to memory. Painting nerds aren't in the habit of making documentaries. We try to make criticism. But increasingly, and perhaps unavoidably when dealing with Byrd, questions of documentation and expression come to the forefront. Given the amazing privilege of requesting available works with which to repopulate the house, we came right up against problems of honesty and aesthetics in a very real way. Why did we need to suggest the artist's presence there? Why curate the space, moving certain objects in and certain objects out? Why film the house at all? Why do we feel the need to capture and record? And why is that never quite enough? In many ways, Byrd's Montrose VA resembles a kind of graphic novel. An art form increasingly personal in nature, diverse in form, and absolutely able to delve seriously into subjects like generational trauma and mental health. Yet it's probably reasonable to assume the book would never have been published as such, due to its complete lack of narrative, its lack of anything resembling conflict and resolution, beyond the open conclusion of the final chilling text box. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest gives Kesey's practically identical experiences shape by narrativizing them, giving them a conventional beginning, middle, and end, heroes and villains. In the paintings and drawings, Byrd literally gives his experiences shape and form, conversely freeing them from the rigidities and contrivances of narrative, bringing them into the realm of wider experience, maximizing their potential relatability. And while the book is now rightly published as a work of graphic literature, of which the artist was justifiably proud, it's only a part of a much larger body of work, a lifetime of work, the implied nature of which changes a great deal depending on how you show and edit it. Painting Nerd's first exposure to Byrd's painting in Europe was 2022's Splendid Isolation, a post-lockdown survey of art made in seclusion, which focused entirely on the tidy narrative of Montrose. Like the 2019 White Columns exhibition curated by Matthew Higgs, it presented him as just that little bit more of a documentarian, even while highlighting the inherent expressiveness of the work. It's a subtle shifting of weight from one foot to the other, but important to recognise if we want to bring the authorial tensions in the work fully into focus. The line between the documentary and the expressive fact and form is, as we said in the introduction, fragile and trembling, something that only gets more complicated when we add the author into the equation. It's impossible to look at Daumier's paintings, for example, without at least some subconscious awareness of them being the work of a political cartoonist, particularly as we watch him approach the same motif in loose sketches, commissioned drawings and commercial prints. The cartoons fine, and the fine work, in some ways, cartoonish. It's perhaps not for nothing that one of his favourite subjects was Don Quixote, its changing series of comically unreliable narrators telling the adventures of a delusional hero suffering from a kind of narrativistic mania. The narrative itself, a certain layering of voice and veracity, truth and invention. We might even speculate on some level about Daumier's own sense of the forking paths in front of him each time he picked up a drawing implement, contemplating the misty lines between reportage, caricature, satire, art. In a similar sense, shows which mix the various threads of Byrd's oeuvre ultimately push the Montrose pictures that bit more in the direction of subjective expression, personal expression. After all, the character and biography of the artist himself are huge, unavoidable presences within the work, whether we want to bring them squarely into the frame or drag them out, like this distracting sofa bed. Our narrative impulses are triggered, both by the aesthetically satisfying contours of the artist's life and by 1,000 moment-to-moment connections which spark between each work and the rest, as if we were reading some vast, essential work of 20th century prose. In the end, on balance and all things considered, we are left with the question, just what kind of work is it? What is the exact nature of this sprawling, painterly version of the great American novel? Is Byrd's painted world more like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or is it more like Samuel Fuller's Shock Corridor? On the surface, a pulpy film about a reporter feigning insanity to solve a murder in a mental hospital, which ultimately becomes a much more personal meditation on the social conditions that put people there in the first place. Or is his clear-sighted vision more like Frederick Wiseman's incendiary 1967 documentary Titicut Follies, a once-banned film which highlighted the abusive treatment of patients at the Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane? Titled after the hospital talent show, Titicut Follies would perhaps bizarrely, perhaps fittingly, be turned into a ballet in 2017, leaping between the hyper-objective and the hyper-choreographed in a single bound. Though, of course, the original film can't help but make expressive choices of shot and composition at every moment, even if it tries not to, even if that choice is itself an expressive one. A purposeful avoidance of anything like Shock Corridor's relatively baroque flourishes, its close-ups and pans, its lighting and sound design, its flashes of colour stock footage. We might remember that anything given form brings with it expression, but that some forms express more or express differently than others. Byrd's sustained project shows that painting loses none of its expressiveness in acting more documentarily, and perhaps more importantly, none of its documentary value in being profoundly expressionist. Part of the sheer brilliance of Byrd's painting is that it manages to seamlessly synthesize all of these approaches, somehow able to convey a sense of formal dance, objective reportage, and personal catharsis. Mind, hospital, and world at large.